All right, no need to be shy. Come on. I got a very interesting talk for all of you, hopefully. All right, before I get started, by show of hands, who's been in crypto since 2020? Like, since the year 2020? Okay, maybe like a third of the room. What about 2018? Okay, I still got a few hands. 2016? Okay, okay, okay. 2014? Okay, all right. 2012? 2010? 2008. So you've been in crypto since the beginning, basically. Okay, well, wow, okay. $1 Bitcoin, okay. So I'm going to give you guys basically a crash course from the beginning of $1 Bitcoin until today. And we're going to take a quick tour of some of the key events that led up to where we are, how the industry evolved, some of the key innovations, stuff like that. So starting off 2008, Bitcoin white paper launches, right? So everyone, I think, has seen this at this point. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. So this was the white paper that changed the world, so to speak. So before Bitcoin, there were other technologies that tried to do something similar. But this was the first time where you actually had a fully functioning system where you could own your own money and send it to other people without having to rely on an intermediary. So that was the revolution that Bitcoin brought on, but everyone here is already familiar with Bitcoin. So we'll move on to the next couple of years. So fast forward a few years, not much is happening in the space. Bitcoin just kind of hums along, producing new blocks. And a lot of people are starting to, try to cash in on kind of this crypto mindshare. So you have a lot of people who launch copycat coins or chains, right? So a lot of the famous copycats are like, Litecoin, Dogecoin, for example. And people are also experimenting with new consensus protocols as well. So you got projects like Ripple, which is still around, as well as a whole bunch of projects that I'm sure most of you have never seen or heard of. But they used to be big back in the day, right? Like back in the day, if you wanted a decentralized stablecoin, you would go to BitShares. Who here knows what BitShares is? Okay, the same OG. Okay, so yeah, but essentially, like there were hundreds of these projects and tokens that launched that we don't even hear about anymore, but they kind of laid the groundworks for what we would consider DeFi today. So, but most of these early coins, they were just forks of Bitcoin. So they just took the Bitcoin code base, changed a few parameters, called it a day. But most of them, with the exception of a few, are no longer around. So that was like the first, 4, 5, 6 years. And then, okay, so what actually put Bitcoin on the map, right? So people talk about, pivotal moments in the early history of Bitcoin. People talk about, the first transaction where someone bought a pizza with 10,000 Bitcoin or whatever. But I would argue that the thing that put Bitcoin on the map is the thing that still people talk about the most, which is price, right? So when Bitcoin price goes up, more people notice, and that brings in more people. And that cycle is kind of continued ever since. But the cycle kind of began in 2010. So in 2010, Bitcoin transitioned from being like this, very new age experimental, like digital money that people would send each other for fun or, send to their friends to try to get them to find a use case for it or something, into something that people actually wanted to buy. And the way that this transition happened is with the launch of the first popular exchange. So who here has heard of Mt. Gox? Okay, so at least some of you have heard of Mt. Gox. Okay, who here has heard of FTX? Okay, more of you have heard of FTX. So Mt. Gox is the original FTX. So this is how all the early Bitcoin holders lost their money. So basically, Mt. Gox was a centralized exchange, or CEX, and a lot of people deposited their Bitcoin onto Mt. Gox so that they could trade it and speculate on the price of Bitcoin, essentially. And Mt. Gox launched when Bitcoin was less than 10 cents. So the first Bitcoin that traded on Mt. Gox was 9 cents, and then at the highest point, Bitcoin was trading for over $1,000 on Mt. Gox. So that's like a 10,000x increase. And I would argue that Mt. Gox played a very large role in this price discovery journey. But the downside of Mt. Gox was they did not really have very good operational security. So over their history, they actually experienced multiple hacks. And eventually, they had to disclose to their customers that they had actually gotten hacked so many times that they no longer had most of their Bitcoin. They had lost over 2/3 of all their Bitcoin holdings. So Mt. Gox was forced to shut down. There was a whole controversy. It led to the first big Bitcoin crash here from 1,000 to almost $200. And what people learned from this experience was not your keys, not your funds. So who here has heard that term before? Okay, so that kind of became popularized after the whole Mt. Gox incident because people realized, hey, if I'm trusting this centralized exchange with all my Bitcoin, I have no guarantee that I actually own this money anymore, right? It's like when you deposit your funds onto Binance, for example. You have to trust that Binance will manage your money correctly, that they won't lose it to a hack, or an insider won't steal the funds or whatever. So this is why you hear so many crypto people encourage you to self-custody, right? Meaning you have your own wallet, which you control the private key for, and you know that you own your funds. So all of that started because Mt. Gox taught us this valuable lesson where if you trust someone else, then there's no guarantee you can get your money back, right? So after the whole Mt. Gox drama died down, Bitcoin, of course, continued to survive and continue to thrive even. But that didn't stop people from thinking about the future. So even though Bitcoin adoption was growing very steadily, people thought that the potential of cryptocurrency was not being fully realized by Bitcoin itself. Because with Bitcoin, all you can do is just transfer the coin from one person to another, right? You can't build more interesting applications on top without having to actually change the protocol itself. And that's because Bitcoin doesn't support any logic on the chain. Well, that's not entirely true. There are some operations you can do, but you can't write a program on Bitcoin, for example. And that's where Ethereum came in. So Ethereum came into the scene around 2014. So they raised a lot of money from existing Bitcoin holders as well as other investors. And their vision was to build a blockchain where you could actually execute and write code, right? So you could have a trustless system which executes this logic for you, and you can always trust that what the code says is what will be done. So this is very different than some of the early Bitcoin applications that were built, which relied on you to deposit your Bitcoin somewhere, and then you trust some web admin to manage your Bitcoin correctly. So with Ethereum, you could actually look on chain, see what the logic is, and know exactly what was going to be executed. So I would argue that Ethereum actually basically introduced a paradigm shift into the way that people think about cryptocurrency. So before Ethereum, people thought about cryptocurrency as just another money or another investment that you can speculate on. Maybe the price goes up, maybe the price goes down. But now people are actually thinking about use cases, right? They're thinking about how can we take things that exist in, traditional finance or, from the Web 2 internet ecosystem, and how can we make it better or more resilient or more censorship resistant or more decentralized, all that sort of stuff. So Ethereum, of course, is not without its own drama. So Ethereum actually experienced a hack very early on, where a lot of the ETH that was locked up in the early Ethereum DAO was stolen, and that's when they decided to hard fork the Ethereum network. So a hard fork is when all the people who are running the network get together and they decide, hey, we're actually going to go back and rewrite history. So this was kind of, this was something that people thought undermined the legitimacy of Ethereum, but as we'll see, a lot of protocols have kind of had to take a similar approach, especially with all the hacks and security incidents that has happened. So this kind of set the precedent for community-driven governance. So rather than only relying on the code and only relying on, what is written in stone, people are actually doing consensus off-chain to decide, okay, what's best for the community in the long run, where do we want to go? And the Ethereum community has managed to do this pretty smoothly to, transition the network from proof of work to proof of stake, as well as a whole bunch of other innovations that we'll see later on. Okay, so what was the first real use case for Ethereum? So, I would love to say it was something like groundbreaking that helped a lot of people, but honestly, the first real innovation of Ethereum was ICOs. So who here has ever purchased an ICO in the past? Okay, we got a small number of ICO investors in the crowd. Okay, so 2017 is when the ICO mania really started. So this was when you could write a white paper, put up a landing page, publish your address, and then people would send thousands or sometimes even millions of dollars to you for nothing, right? You have no product, you have, sometimes not even a roadmap, just a promise, a pretty logo, and some charts that look, up and to the right. So, I have some charts down here that kind of show so on the left-hand side, we see all the ICO fundraising that happened. So at the beginning of 2017, it was pretty modest, but by the middle of 2017 and towards the end, we had companies raising billions of dollars off of, little more than pretty presentations and, maybe some demos. And as time went on, we would see that the vast majority of ICO projects ended up losing money, compared to the price that people bought the ICO token for. So, I think this is what gave a lot of early crypto projects kind of a bad reputation. When people think ICOs and people think crypto, a lot of people would think like scam or, rug pull or whatever. And that's because so many projects essentially did nothing, right? They took investor money, they, went and bought like a villa in, Bali or something, and then they just disappeared. So, but there were a few gems that came out of this. So despite so many projects failing, there were a few innovations that survived and actually laid the groundwork for what we consider DeFi today. So DeFi, as everyone I'm sure is aware, stands for decentralized finance. And in the early days of DeFi, people were not really sure, what people would actually use, what kind of use cases people cared about. So people built all sorts of things, right? So here's a diagram, I think, from 2018, which showed the top DeFi protocols. So you have categories like, lending, trading, stable coins, investment management, insurance, whatever. So you'll see that on here, you'll probably recognize, a few of these logos, but a lot of these projects also no longer exist or have been overtaken by, newer competitors. So in particular, the whole like KYC and identity space is kind of collapsed, I would argue. Um, but that doesn't stop people from innovating. And the people that survived kind of the 2017 ICO hype, projects like Maker, Aave, Uniswap, which came a little bit later, they actually are now the foundation of DeFi. So most projects that come out today, they build on top of these primitives, as people call it. And this is where the term money Legos comes from. So basically, like in traditional finance, right? Like if I want to work with a bank, I have to have a lot of money or a lot of connections or something. Like it's very hard for me as a regular person to build a business on top of an existing financial product. But in DeFi, no one can tell you what to do, right? If you want to write a protocol that uses Uniswap in the back end, like no one can stop you from doing that. You just write the code, you deploy it, and then anyone can use the product. So this has opened up a lot of innovation that was previously impossible, right? In the past, like you couldn't connect a lending market and an exchange together unless you were a big financial institution already. But now anyone can just write a few lines of Solidity and they're off to the races. So that was sort of the big real use case that came out of the ICO boom. So what happened after DeFi? So towards the tail end of the DeFi hype cycle, we saw the first NFT projects start to take off. So back in 2018, there was a very popular NFT project called CryptoKitties. Did anyone ever own any CryptoKitties? Okay, we have a small number of CryptoKitties early adopters here, but CryptoKitties was kind of the foreshadowing for a lot of the NFT hype that would come later on. So I think if I remember correctly, like CryptoKitties was single-handedly responsible for increasing like Ethereum transaction costs by like 100 times or something like that. But CryptoKitties died down along with the whole rest of the DeFi space after the 2018 crash. And we wouldn't really see NFTs pick up again until 2021. So in 2021, people started pushing the narrative of NFTs as collectibles, as digital identity pieces, as something that you could collect, similar to how people collect art, and that this would be a form of investment and that the price would go up. And this sounds very similar to the ICO boom, right? And if you look at some of the adoption charts for NFT, transaction count and transaction volume numbers, you see a very similar trend. So in the beginning, you have some people who adopted NFTs, they made a lot of money, and other people see, oh wow, these NFT investors, they're so smart, they made so much money, I want to do the same thing. And that's what led to the 2022 like NFT mania, where people were buying, all sorts of random NFT collections for like tens of thousands of dollars that are now practically worthless. But what this, with every kind of bubble that we get, at the end of the bubble, a little bit of value remains, right? So with the whole DeFi bubble, we got like Uniswap and Aave and Maker and a few other, key protocols that survived. Out of the NFT bubble, we got a few like NFT communities, we got a few NFT standards, we got a few like NFT use cases that people actually found valuable. But the vast majority of NFT projects did not survive. So I think this cycle, we'll see like we'll see for DeFi, we'll see for NFTs what we saw for DeFi in 2020. So we're going to see another big run up, but I think we'll see some actual more useful use cases for NFTs. So speaking of 2020 DeFi, so after the 2018 hype cycle, people were like, oh, okay, DeFi is dead, like all of that. It was just like crazy people talking about internet money. Like there's no real value here, right? So around 2020, 2021 is when this narrative started to pick up again around, oh, wait, actually, maybe DeFi has some value there. Maybe we can actually find some use cases. So this is when people started to build more creative DeFi protocols. So if you compare like the complexity of DeFi protocols from 2018 to like the 2020s, you can see a big difference. So I put a diagram here of Abracadabra, which is one of the popular DeFi protocols, in the 2020 to 2022 hype cycle. And this is like one of the simpler to understand diagrams, right? Like they tried really hard to make this as easy to understand as possible. So, it was a lot of these like people who were trying to do all these gymnastics to figure out, okay, how can we take this money here, move it there to make it worth a little bit more, and then move it to this other place to make it, even more valuable. So essentially people were creating a lot of like very interconnected leverage within this system, right? So people were taking assets, rehypothecating these assets, using those assets as collateral to borrow more assets. And it led to this huge run up by the time we got to 2021. So DeFi TVL basically exploded from what looks like nothing. I mean, it was around like maybe $1 billion or so, all the way up to 180 billion at peak. And a lot of these projects relied on people believing that more people would come in and use these protocols and increase the protocol's value, which sounds a lot like a Ponzi, because it kind of is. But in crypto, we don't call it a Ponzi. We call it V33. Okay, so V33 is this idea that you can align incentives between governance token holders and users of the protocol in such a way that you get like this infinite growth machine, right? But in reality, there's no real infinite growth machine. And a lot of these projects like Olympus, Abracadabra, Convex, Curve, they eventually collapsed under their own weight because they couldn't sustain the high yields that they were promising. So that was one big category of DeFi projects that came out. Another big category of DeFi projects that some of you are probably more familiar with is algorithmic stablecoins. So who here remembers Terra? Okay, we have a lot of pained expressions in the audience. Okay, so Terra, as well as a couple of other algorithmic stablecoins, really paved the way for convincing people that they can print money out of thin air, right? Basically, the whole idea behind Terra was, we are going to make this stablecoin, which is backed by our own token. And as long as the value of our own token goes up, you can always redeem the stablecoin for an equivalent amount. And they were paying out like these crazy APYs, like, 20, 25%. And the party was really good, right? Like, we went from like 0 TVL all the way up to like 20 billion at peak. And everyone was rich, right? Everyone was making a lot of money. People loved to think that they were getting safe and stable 20% returns on their money. And all they had to do was just sit on it, right? Like no, complicated looping necessary. None of that abracadabra stuff. But unfortunately, the problem with a lot of these algorithmic stablecoin models is that they relied on the protocol to grow infinitely. Like as long as you could continue to bring in more people, and as long as those people brought him more money, everything would keep going, right? But the moment it stops, it enters into a negative feedback cycle, and you have like this death spiral, which lasted like 1 or 2 days, where everything just goes to shit, right? So, this sounds a lot like a Ponzi, because I would argue that it was. And most of this value kind of evaporated, and people thought, okay, this is a big tragedy. You know, a lot of people lost a lot of money. People feel like they got scammed or whatever. But most people thought, okay, this is it, right? Like this stablecoin collapsed. You know, people lost like $20 billion, but the rest of the industry can keep going on, right? But that was not the case. So what I'm going to talk about now is all the other dominoes that fell after Terra collapsed. So earlier I talked about FTX. So in between the Terra collapse and the FTX collapse, we had a whole bunch of other projects and funds and whatever who had exposure to Terra or the Terra ecosystem who lost a bunch of money, and those people who lost money, you know, would either try to lie to their customers to prevent them from escaping, or they would just collapse and try to return whatever money they had left. And sort of the biggest domino to fall in all of this chaos was FTX. So FTX was an exchange that was started back in 2021, but the team that started FTX had actually been around since 2017 as part of Alameda Research. So Alameda Research was one of the early crypto funds that was doing like Bitcoin price arbitrage, and they made a big name for themselves. So when they started FTX, everyone thought, okay, this would be the next big thing. It's going to overtake Coinbase. It's going to overtake Binance. And for a while, you know, they were on their way to realizing that vision. But unfortunately, for one reason or another, you know, greed or incompetence or something got a hold of the FTX team. They decided to gamble with customer money and to try to backfill it with their own token. And once everyone realized this was happening, people lost confidence in FTX, which caused the token price to collapse, and it caused FTX to be fully under collateralized. And this was kind of the nail in the coffin of 2022's hype cycle, right? So everyone was like, okay, you know, we have all these new DeFi use cases. NFTs are going to the moon. Oh, okay, we have Terra collapse. Okay, that hurt a little bit, but you know, it's not too bad. We can keep going. And then, okay, oh, BlockFi collapsed, but it's okay. I only had a little bit of money on BlockFi. Oh, Celsius collapsed. Okay, not too bad, you know. Like, I still have some money on my exchange accounts. And then when FTX collapsed, you know, that's when it really hurt for a lot of people, because a lot of people were doing their trading, they were doing their custody, like everything they had was on FTX. So this was the end of the bull run, so to speak. So now we're in a bear market. And during a bear market is actually when a lot of innovation happens in the background. So, you know, people often are the loudest when Bitcoin price is the highest, but there's a lot of stuff that happens during the downtime when, you know, Bitcoin price is low and no one's paying attention that really sets the stage for the next cycle. And one of those things, I would argue, is Ethereum transitioning from proof of work to proof of stake. So when Ethereum transitioned to proof of stake, so number one, it reduced energy consumption because miners no longer had to do these expensive computations. Number two, it changed the way that the network was secured. So for the first time, you had like a tier one blockchain that was relying on proof of stake instead of proof of work. And the biggest implication for this next bull run, I would say, is it spawned a whole industry around staking. So in the early days, like people would take their ETH, they would run their own node and they would stake it and whatever. But then people realized, hey, wait a minute. Instead of me staking the ETH, which locks up my liquidity, why don't I start a protocol which lets people stake their ETH, and I can give them a token that represents that ETH and all the staking that happened in it. And that way you can free up liquidity. People can use these liquid staking tokens in DeFi, all that sort of stuff. So that's what spawned the beginning of the liquid staking revolution. So Lido was the first sort of popular liquid staking protocol. They really put liquid staking on the map. But of course, there's a lot of other liquid staking tokens for ETH now. And so that was good for a while, right? Like during bear markets, people are happy with 3%, 4% return on their ETH. But once the bull market gets started, people are like, okay, that's not enough. How can we juice these returns even more, right? So that's where you have protocols like EigenLayer who are now doing restaking. So restaking is this idea that you can leverage the ETH that you're already using to secure the network, to secure other networks, and get paid like some sort of reward in return, right? So now instead of earning 4%, you can earn something higher, some TBD amount of yield. But what that's caused is it's caused a bunch of people to now enter an arms race of liquid restaking. So now people are trying to wrap these restaked Ethereum tokens, and these restaked Ethereum tokens are all fighting for market share, and that's actually led to another big innovation, which I'll talk about here. So a lot of these restaking projects, instead of doing like the traditional model of, okay, you give me, transaction volume or TVL or something like that, and I give you an airdrop. Instead of doing that, these models these projects are actually trying to put more concrete numbers on this sort of like user feedback cycle. So right now, there's this big movement of projects launching points. So who here has farmed some points before? Okay, we have a few points farmers in the crowd. So points are the latest iteration of airdrop farming, right? So back in the day, you would go use a protocol, pray that you get onto the airdrop list, and then look at your wallet every day until you get the tokens, right? But now, instead of giving you this like uncertainty around, okay, did I qualify for the airdrop? How much airdrop value am I going to get? What these projects are doing is they're giving you a dashboard where you can view, okay, here's the actions I've done. This is how many points it's worth. And there's even marketplaces out there which try to price the value of your points. So I have a screenshot here of Pendle. So Pendle has become a very popular platform for people to speculate on the points values of a lot of these liquid restaking protocols. And the crazy part is you can actually bet against these points farmers, and for a period of time, if you thought that the points were overvalued and you wanted to bet against the value of these points, you could actually earn like 60 to 70% APY on your ETH. That's like unheard of, right? Like, we went from like 3% ETH staking returns to like 60, 70%, Pendle points farming craziness. So points, I think, in addition to just getting more people interested in crypto, has done something that I think will continue to be used in the space, which is more clear user alignment, right? So in the past, like me as a user, like I'm just going to randomly use DeFi protocols and hope that one of them gives me an airdrop. But from the protocol's perspective, like I'm probably rewarding a bunch of users who are never going to use my protocol again, who may not have even provided that much value, who I don't even know for a fact, like actually used my protocol instead of just, accessing it through like an aggregator or something like that. So what points allows these projects to do is more granularly assign value, right? So if you brought, $10,000 worth of value to this protocol, you should earn 10 times more than someone who brought $1,000 worth of value to this protocol, right? So points is the way that projects have invented to better align those incentives. So my prediction is that for this next bull run, maybe not every, but like 80% of the projects that you interact with are going to have a points program. So understanding like how to take advantage of them, understanding when you're getting taken advantage of by the points, like this is the important part for the next generation of airdrop farmers. So if you want to be smart, study up on points. That's my advice. And the last topic I'll touch on here is multi-chain. So in the past, most activity happened on one chain, which is Ethereum, right? So if we look at the 2017, 2018, like ICO hype, DeFi hype, all of that was on Ethereum. If we look at the 2020 to 2022 NFT hype, pretty much all of that was on Ethereum as well. DeFi summer, most of that TVL was on Ethereum. But now we're entering an era where there's more and more layer ones that are competing for mind share, market share, TVL. So you have protocols, like what was mentioned earlier, like Aptos, Sui. You have protocols like Solana. You have protocols like, BNB Smart Chain. You have protocols like, like Cosmos, the whole Cosmos ecosystem, right? So there's so many choices out there for users. And most users, they don't want to go through the pain of moving their funds from one chain to another. So in the past, what this looks like is, okay, I take my Ethereum funds, I deposit it onto an exchange, I trade all of those funds for, the native asset of whatever chain I'm trying to get onto, right? Maybe that's Sol for Solana. And then I withdraw that Sol onto Solana, and then I can swap it for like stable coins or other assets. So you spend a lot of money on trading fees, you spend a lot of time, there's a lot of like headaches trying to get accounts on exchanges and whatever. So the big pain point that's been addressed is actually allowing users to move funds between chains without having to rely on a centralized intermediary. So the two biggest protocols in this space are probably Axelar and Layer 0. So both of these protocols have a lot of bridges or cross-chain liquidity protocols built on top of them. And there's, of course, a lot of other competitors coming up in recent years as well. So this was kind of the first attempt for blockchains to address like interoperability or cross-chain liquidity. But now a lot of chains are actually looking at this at a more native level. So you have organizations like Optimism, Arbitrum, Polygon. They're thinking a couple years ahead, and they're thinking, okay, a lot of teams are going to launch layer 2s, layer 3s, layer 4s, right? Like how can we make it so that users don't have to jump through all these hoops to move money back and forth? And how can they make it so that users don't even have to think about what chain that they're on? So I think this is going to be a big trend, either this cycle or next cycle. So as we move forward, I think the user experience is going to be less focused on what chain am I on and more focused on, okay, what kind of use case or what kind of asset do I want to get access to? So there's a lot of cool tech stacks out there like, Optimism Superchain, Arbitrum Orbit, Polygon CDK. So if you're looking to build something that is chain agnostic or works across multiple chains, I think this is a very promising trend. And with that, I think I've pretty much caught us up to where we are today. So of course I skipped a few topics, right, like Bitcoin ordinals and some other stuff, but I think only at the end of this bull cycle will we be able to look back and say, okay, what was truly important? What was just a fad? So hopefully in 2 or 3 years, when I give this talk again, I'll be able to add a few more slides about all the innovation that's happened since today. But for now, I'll leave it here, and I'll open up the floor to any questions, actually. Yeah, thank you. All right, anyone have anything they're curious about since the beginning of time until today? Now? What is your thought about altitude? And what is it like? Say if you Okay, so the question is like, what is my opinion on like layer twos and all of this infrastructure around Ethereum staking? And the second question is, what do I see as kind of like the killer use case that's going to bring in the next wave of users? Is that right? So I think these two questions are actually very related. So I'll try to group it into one question. So I think for the next few years, I think the biggest use case in crypto will continue to be finance. And the reason for that is the infrastructure is not yet to a point where non-financial applications built on top of blockchain are better than traditional web applications, right? So traditional web applications, contrary to what all the crypto people will tell you, traditional web applications are very good at what they do, right? They're efficient, they're cost effective, they're responsive, massively scalable, right? Like there's so much money that's been invested into traditional web infrastructure, and it works very well. So the use cases that will get taken over by crypto and blockchain first are the ones that have the highest economic impact, right? And that usually translates into finance, right? Like if I have a database of $1 trillion and that database gets hacked, that's a very big financial impact, right? Whereas if I put that ledger onto the blockchain, for example, for just a few dollars, I can now secure my transaction in a way that would be cost prohibitive to secure in like a traditional web context. So, all of this is to say that I think the next killer use case for blockchain is going to continue to be finance. I think we're going to continue to lower the barrier for how hard it is to use DeFi so that more and more people can move their bank accounts, move their investment accounts, move more and more of their traditional financial infrastructure into crypto, right? Like in countries like, like here in Vietnam, for example, we already see a lot of people who don't keep a lot of money in their traditional bank account anymore. They keep their money in like USDT. They use decentralized exchanges or Binance or whatever. So, in a similar way to how countries like China, for example, like China just completely skipped like credit cards and moved on to like digital payment apps. I think a lot of countries are going to skip past a lot of these, fintech companies that more developed countries have and move straight into DeFi. So how does this tie into like layer twos and layer threes and all of this Ethereum staking stuff? So I think as more and more people enter crypto, you're going to have to account for this new traffic somehow, right? So Ethereum mainnet can only support like, maybe a few 100,000 users at most, right? So really, it's going to be up to application developers to launch their own layer twos, their own layer threes, and to build good infrastructure for them so that new users that come in, they don't have to worry about, okay, where do I get some ETH to pay for gas? Where do I write down my private key so that I don't lose all my life savings? Like these usability problems are going to be, I think, they have been and they'll continue to be one of the most important problems to solve to bring in like the next billion, Web3 users. Yeah, account abstraction, stuff like MPC. Like a lot of people are trying a lot of different approaches to make crypto more usable, but only time will tell what actually ends up, solving some of these problems. Yeah, so hopefully I answered your question. Does anyone else have any other questions? If not, I will conclude this talk and hope you all have a good rest of your journey into crypto or DeFi.